the bill at that particular meeting. This council resumes the second reading debate on the temporary protection measures for business tenants COVID-19 pandemic bill. Mr. Tommy Cheung, Chairman of the Bills Committee on the bill, will first address the Council on the committee's report. Mr. Tommy Cheung. Thank you. President, as the Chairman of the Bills Committee on Temporary Protection Measures for Business Tenants COVID-19 Pandemic Bill, I would like to report the key deliberations of the Bills Committee. The bill seeks to implement one of the proposals in the budget delivered by the Financial Secretary on the 23rd of February 2022 to provide temporary protection measures to business tenants who are badly hit by the COVID-19 epidemic. The measures are to impose a moratorium on landlords' rights to take rental enforcement actions for a period of 3 months, hereinafter referred to as the protection period. At the same time, to relieve the short-term financial difficulties that some landlord borrowers may face arising from the rental enforcement moratorium. The bill proposes to impose a moratorium on lenders' rights to take security enforcement actions. Security enforcement moratorium, in short, against landlord borrowers. The Bills Committee has held 2 meetings with the administration and invited written submissions from the public on the bill. Most members expressed support for the bill. They agreed that the relevant protection measures would give business tenants of specified premises in trouble some breathing space. Members also supported the provisions in the bill to allow tenants, landlords, and lenders to enter into new tenancy or secured loan agreements during the protection period to contract out of the rental or security enforcement moratorium. Some members asked the administration to retain the option of extending the protection period by 3 months as necessary. The administration explained that since the announcement of the budget, it has been intensively engaging various sectors to hear their views on the bill. Taking into consideration the concerns expressed by major stakeholders, the administration has decided that the extension be removed so as to enhance the certainty of the bill. Some members suggested adding more types of premises to Schedule 2 of the bill to cover more premises in relation to the food business, such as takeaway shops, central kitchens, food processing plants, bakeries, etc. Having regard to members' suggestions, the administration agreed to move amendments to extend the coverage of specified premises in relation to the food and catering business under Part 2 of the schedule to the bill. There were also members who expressed various concerns about the bill, while some other members were opposed to it. Some members expressed grave concerns that some landlords may face short-term financial difficulties arising from the rental enforcement moratorium or suffer from possible loss of rental income as tenants with operational difficulties may eventually evade their liability to pay rent. The administration responded that a security enforcement moratorium is provided in the bill, and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and other relevant departments would exercise supervisory oversight to ensure compliance with these legal requirements. For individual landlords who live up rental income from specified special premises they hold, the administration will provide such landlords with an interest-free loan equivalent to 3 months' rent under the 100% personal loan guarantee scheme, subject to a ceiling of $100,000. Some members were of the view that the protection measures should target those in need, and thus the application of the bill should be restricted to SMEs and should exclude large enterprises, such as those which have shares listed on the Stock Exchange of Hong Kong Limited. The administration responded that if the application of the bill is restricted to SMEs, it would mean that some businesses, no matter how hard they are affected by the fifth wave of the epidemic, will not be protected by the bill. This runs counter to the objectives of the bill of the government. The administration pointed out that many medium-sized restaurants and retail outlets are operated by small listed companies. If they are carved out from the protection of the measures and are forced to close down, the resulting unemployment can be rather substantial. Some members expressed concerns that the proposed rental enforcement moratorium may affect the principle of free market operation of the local economy, compromise the sanctity of contracts, and have implications on the right of private ownership of property under the Basic Law. The administration responded that the outbreak of the fifth wave of the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting tightening of social distancing measures has dealt a blow with unprecedented severity and magnitude to different sectors and individuals. The proposed protection measures are introduced under exceptional circumstances to prevent large-scale business closures. The proposed protection measures are not something novel. Some overseas jurisdictions, such as the United Kingdom, Singapore, and Australia, have rolled out measures of similar nature, though with a wider scope of protection, longer protection period, etc., in the midst of extremely serious epidemic situation. A member expressed the view that as the bill bars landlords from taking rental enforcement actions from the 1st of January 2022 to the end of the protection period, the relevant period in short, it gives retrospective effect to rental enforcement moratorium, which is contrary to the common law tradition. The administration has advised that the commencement date of the 1st of January 2022 is proposed with reference to the start of the fifth wave of the COVID-19 epidemic. If the commencement date of the relevant period is deferred to the commencement date of the bill, the effectiveness of the bill would be undermined. The administration also advised that the mere fact that a legislation is framed by reference to things that happened before the legislation has come into effect is not tantamount to making the legislation retrospective. In any event, there is no prohibition against retrospective legislation in Hong Kong. Mr. Louis Leung and Ms. Doreen Kwong have respectively submitted draft amendments to the bill to the Bills Committee. Mr. Leung's amendments seek to 1. Restrict the application of the bill to SME tenants, and 2. Defer the commencement date of the relevant periods from the 1st of January 2022 to the commencement date of the bill. Ms. Kong's amendments seek to 1. Require rates, government rent, management fees, and other outgoings payable under a tenancy to have been paid by a tenant before the protection of the bill will become applicable, and 2. Remove the two specified factors to be considered for a landlord to reasonably establish that the tenant's failure to pay rent and the rental enforcement moratorium is the sole reason or a significant reason for the landlord's inability to avoid the repayment's default. Ms. Kong has also proposed an amendment to Mr. Leung's proposed definition of SMEs. After consideration, the Bills Committee decided not to move under its name the amendments proposed by the two members. The Bills Committee raised no objection to the administration's amendments on extending the coverage of the bill to more premises in relation to the food business. President, I would like to turn to my personal views on the bill now. For these temporary short-term measures for MSMEs hit by Cap 599, and there will be a rental enforcement moratorium. So it will offer some breathing space to sectors that have been severely hit by the pandemic, and I support this bill. And also with this measure, the Financial Secretary is to be given due credit for proposing the measure. It's because of his courage that he is putting forward this proposal. And without fear. And he faces up to the challenge presented thereof. And I'm grateful to him, and I admire him for his courage to do so. In fact, the Liberal Party and I have been fighting for this since 2 years ago. At the time, we were fighting for a number of measures. One, rental enforcement moratorium and the 2+2 rental waiver. Now, the Financial Secretary has taken on board our views, and so now we have this temporary protection measures bill, and we're grateful to him. It shows that the Financial Secretary is bold to do that, because many of the landlords are powerful and have influence, and they have the capacity to attack you for doing this. And we're grateful, therefore, you still proceed with the bill. Now, we asked you to legislate as soon as possible for the rental enforcement moratorium, and then very soon you proceeded with consultation. You worked with great efficiency. We didn't even need 6 months consultation period. You were able to do so much in 2 to 3 weeks. Now, of course, much consultation was carried out, and diverse views were heard. Still, and you were prepared to make further amendments to the bill and enhance it to minimize the impact on landlords. Now, the protection period is for 3 months starting from the commencement day of the bill, and then you've removed the original clause to allow another extension of 3 months, and also you including security enforcement and moratorium, so banks could not pursue landlord tenants in relation to the moratorium. And then for those landlords who live off the rental income, the government now would extend the 100% personal loan guarantee scheme to offer rent-free, interest-free loan to these landlords for 3 months. And also, more importantly, there's the contracting out arrangement. So landlords and the tenants could enter into new lease or tenancies. Now, all of these arrangements are included after having listening to the views of the different stakeholders. I think these are good measures, especially for those landlords who have to rely on rental income for paying their mortgage. So you have found a way to help them. And then this is it's not just to care for tenants who are unable to pay rent because of the pandemic, so they're given some breathing space. But and also under this bill, if both parties agree, then that enter into agreement, there's no need to proceed with the protection period. So I've also suggested adding more types of premises in Schedule 2. The application of the bill should not just be restricted to premises with dine-in services, but instead the application should be extended to other food-related premises, such as food processing plants and so on. Because even bakeries, they have lost much income because of social distancing measures. And then food processing plants also struggling to survive under the pandemic. So I'm very much grateful to the government for listening to and taking on board my suggestions. The government is to move an amendment to extend the application of the bill to other premises than those offering dine-in service. Now, the Liberal Party has been advocating rental enforcement moratorium and also a 2+2 rental waiver. That means the government will pay rents for tenants for 2 months, and then landlords will also waive rents for 2 months. So for MSMEs, which are really struggling, they could pay. They won't need to pay rents for 4 months. They will give them some breathing space. So we're grateful to this bill for implementing rental enforcement moratorium. But the government could also take on board the 2+2 rental waiver proposal that would offer even more help to the affected sectors, and they could come out of this plight and they could recover sooner. Because rental enforcement moratorium just offers breathing space. But then many tenants are worried when the protection period ends, they will have to pay the rents in arrear as well, the rents due, and so it would add to their pressure. So the 2+2 rental waiver proposal would give further support to these businesses. I hope the government will consider it. Finally, I'm confident that for the catering business and other sectors, if they are able to pay rent, they certainly would not default on rent payment, because they want to keep in good relationship with landlords. It's also important because it's about the goodwill and reputation of businesses. So businesses would not default on rent payment if they have a choice. Thank you.
Mr. Ronnick Chan. President, I work as a bank consultant. Since this bill involves the banks, I must declare it first. I also sat on the Bills Committee scrutinizing this bill. The object is to provide temporary protection measures for business tenants adversely affected by the COVID-19 to help them to resolve short-term financial difficulties. Hong Kong has been battered by the COVID for more than 2 years. A lot of companies are in financial difficulty and on the brink of collapse, as some of them had gone under. This bill has a noble intent by using short-term measures to help the battered industries to catch some breathing room at the end of the protection period that there will be in time for economic recovery. These industries can be back in business and keeping their companies and jobs. I must point out the tenancy agreement between the landlords and the tenants, as well as the mortgage or security loan agreement between the landlords and the banks, are voluntary civil contracts. Once signed, they are protected by the Hong Kong law and binding on both parties. According to the tenancy characteristics, both empower the landlords and the banks that in case of default, they can immediately exercise certain rights to ensure that the landlords and the banks are protected, to vary the terms or terminate the contractual rights. It requires mutual negotiation or upon a court ruling to be effective. The short-term protection measures as cited by the bill, it only happens and when there is a case of default, the government is using legislative means to ban the banks or the landlords to exercise its legal contractual rights. The Financial Secretary, upon consulting the society, have made a series of amendments and also include these exemption clauses. This bill will compromise the sanctity of contracts, as well as on the league, there will be huge implications for the civil contracts. I hope this is just a one-off measures to help the SMEs to survive. Unless absolutely necessary, we should not introduce similar measures in the future. Since there's no precedent, the bill has certain prohibitions against the banks, and so as to create a short-term protection measure disproportionately benefiting the tenants. As we all know, when the mortgage collateral is leased to the tenants, it requires the bank's approval. If the borrower breach its obligations, which cause the banks to the tenants are still protected. If the banks decide to act against the borrower or exercise other rights, it would not compromise the temporary protection against designated industries. In spite of this, Hong Kong's banking sector has expressed that it will follow the HKMA guidelines, flexibly deals with cases of landlords being default due to the tenants' rent in arrears. For the clause 7 and 8 are eminently necessary. The bill should focus on the short-term protection for commercial tenants. At the special FC meeting, I asked the administration, since the banking sector has been working with the government anti-relief measures and there's no proof of the banks refusing to operate, why decide to take a legislative route? The administration replied that it's not that not confident of the bank's cooperation. It's just that landlords' representatives stated that by it's more peace of mind if we're able to implement the security enforcement moratorium. The banking sector reluctantly obliged. Since the protection period only lasts for 3 months, after 3 months, the rights will be reinstated. Therefore, some of the definitions and the calculations will be insignificant. Therefore, I will not support Mr. Lewis Lung's amendments. President, in fact, the 3 months protection periods will lapse very soon. Whether this protection period can really lead to the rebirth of certain industries or is simply kicking the can down the road, where further reliefs and protection can really bring the SME out of the woods. Important to restore our spending power. They need to have a future by spending a way out. We need to seize this 3 months protection period to bring Hong Kong together in fight the epidemic while achieving quarantine travel so that we can reset our economy for a full recovery. If we can achieve this vision, then the passage of this bill will have its historical significance. President, even though this bill is not perfect, however, in view of the special circumstances, therefore, I will support this bill and the government's amendments. I so submit. Thank you. Mr. Michael Tian. Mr. Tian, are you speaking? President, as I said in the previous item, this rental enforcement moratorium upon its launch, I found it redundant. At the end, we couldn't help the tenants. They need to pay the rent sooner or later. Therefore, I made multiple suggestions, one of which will be requiring the government to provide incentives to the landlords to reduce their rent. The government finally adopted the suggestion. If the landlord are willing to cut the rent, there will be right to contract out. Therefore, I support this bill as a whole. For some members moving their amendments to restrict the applicability to be limited to the SMEs, I support this point as well. Since that we need to strike a balance between the tenants and the landlords. However, this amendment also amends the effective date, which I disagree. This measure hopes to help those tenants affected by the fifth wave. Therefore, I would abstain on voting for the amendments. I so submit.
Mr. Chen Xiu-hong. Thank you, President. I speak in support of the temporary protection measures for business tenants COVID-19 epidemic bill. I'm a member of the Bills Committee. I met with many tenants and other stakeholders. I've listened very carefully to the views and I have weighed the pros and cons very carefully, and then I decided to support the bill. I'm glad to see that the Financial Secretary, Mr. Paul Chan, is thinking out of the box to come up with an innovative way to help sectors affected by the fifth wave of the epidemic. In particular, the Financial Secretary, after he proposed the temporary protection measures, there was much controversy, but still the Financial Secretary kept an open mind and he proactively communicated with different sectors of the community and stakeholders. He listened to the views and he tried his best to strike a balance between landlords and tenants, and I must commend him for his effort. Now, I now decide to vote in support of the bill is because I agree with the legislative intent of the bill to help tenants. Well, the fifth wave of the epidemic hit us hard and fast, and there were unprecedented social distancing measures in fighting this epidemic, and of course different sectors will be affected, especially the micro and SMEs. Now the MSMEs struggled to survive. They had little business. They are under immense pressure to pay rent and to pay wages. So we can imagine how much they are struggling. So the bill would offer a rental moratorium, and then for sectors seriously affected by the fifth wave of the epidemic, would not be pursued rents by the landlords for a certain period. So this is a timely relief to offer these tenants some breathing space. So that's why the rental enforcement moratorium. Of course, the rental enforcement moratorium is not as useful as rental waiver altogether. But then, during this difficult time, we should offer every bit of help we could. And even if we're just helping SMEs to have some breathing space, we should still do it, even though it only helps so much. At the same time, also supporting this bill because I can see the administration has tried its very best to minimize the impact for landlords with the rental enforcement moratorium. Well, when the Financial Secretary first announced this measure, I had grave reservation because it seems the government is just, casting aside the interests of landlords to help tenants. So it's like the government is hosting the tenants to a meal, but then it's the landlords that picks up the tab. And because there are many elderly landlords who live off rental income. So I was worried that with the rental enforcement moratorium, the livelihood of these landlords might be affected. But I see that after listening to the views of the different sectors, the administration has proposed amendments to the bill to protect landlords. For example, for landlords who live off rental income, they could receive 3 months of interest-free loan under the 100% personal loan guarantee scheme with a ceiling of $100,000. So for landlords who suffer short-term financial difficulties and who are not able to pay mortgage, they will be given help. At the same time, there's this security enforcement moratorium, so banks could not recover mortgage payment in default from this tenants, from this landlord. So the government's therefore striking a balance between landlords and tenants. We believe most landlords are caring landlords. In this difficult time, they would like to tide over this tough time together with the public. And so for these two reasons, I decided to support the bill. Now, although I support the rental enforcement moratorium, it doesn't mean that I don't have any contrary views to the bill, to parts of the bill. Rather, I think there are many areas of the bill that deserve further consideration. For example, the effectiveness of the bill. Now, rental enforcement moratorium is not the same as rental waiver. After 3 months, tenants actually will have an even heavier burden to pay rent in arrears as well as rent due. So the government shouldn't think that this bill is a cure-all solution. Rather, the government should review if there are other ways to help SMEs affected by the pandemic. For example, the government could encourage landlords to offer rent discount or even waiver. And then the government could also offer tax concession on rent waived. And then Singapore, you could refer to the measure of Singapore last year. Well, they could share the rental waiver with landlords on a certain percentage, for example, 30% to 70%. So tenants are offered rental waiver. So these are more effective ways to help MSMEs. Now, there are not many clauses in the bill that will protect the rights of landlords, and the arrangement actually is rather complicated still. For example, landlords have to prove to banks that they are unable to repay the loan because of the rental enforcement moratorium. These are really complex procedures, and for some of the small landlords in particular, the elder landlords, they may not know what to do. So if the bill is passed by this council, I hope the government will come up with some way to streamline the vetting process and protect the rights of landlords. And also, upon the end of the protection period, how should landlords recover the rents, and how should tenants pay the rents? Do they have to pay the rents in arrears in one go, or can they pay by installments? Maybe there are some tenants who go bankrupt or who close down their business after the protection period. Then how are landlords to recover the rents in arrears? So there is no answers to these questions under the bill. So it's up to tenants and landlords. And I hope the government will make the necessary preparation for such scenarios, so that there won't be a wave of litigation cases. Now, Mrs. Louis Long wants to defer the commencement date of the protection period from the 1st of January 2022 to the commencement date of the bill. Well, I have no strong views on that. Now, unless there are special circumstances, no law should be retrospective. And for rent, now about if we stop landlords from recovering rents in arrears since the 1st of January 2022, it's not fair to landlords. And then, and so I'm not against that amendment. But then for Mr. Loong's proposal to restrict the application of the bill to SMEs, I have reservation about that. Because I believe that rental enforcement moratorium is not the same as rental waiver. It doesn't really help SMEs much. It offers some breathing space at most. And Mr. Loong's amendment will carve out many businesses affected by the fifth wave of the pandemic, so they won't even have breathing space. And I don't think that's in line with the legislative intent of the bill. And also, not all businesses affected could be helped. That's why I cannot support Mr. Loong's amendment. President, I'm glad to see that as the epidemic eases, we are now back in this council to debate this bill. I hope when the epidemic becomes stable again, there will be speedy recovery of the economy, and all businesses will see good turnover, and they won't have to struggle to pay rent. Thank you. Ms. Doreen Kong. For the temporary protection measures for business tenant COVID-19 pandemic bill. Now, this bill is receiving a second and third reading today. I am a member of the Bills Committee. I fully appreciate the plights faced by SMEs. Now, for landlords and tenants who could reach an agreement and agree to, say the landlords agree to offer rent discount, then the bill won't apply to such cases. And for other tenancies, for other landlords and tenants who couldn't reach agreement, now how many such cases are there? The government could not really come up with an estimate. From the bill, we can see that the bill could offer short-term relief to tenants in paying rent, but after 3 months, tenants will have to pay all rent in arrears in one go. Otherwise, the landlord could exercise the powers given under the tenancy, that is to terminate the tenancy and to recover all rent in arrears together with interest and other losses. Now, if we look at similar measures adopted in other countries, at the end of the protection period, in most of these countries, tenants will have buffer period to repay the default rents slowly. But then under this bill, there is no such buffer period. That means after the 3 months honeymoon period, the tenants will have to repay all the default rent in one go. And we can imagine what the situation would be like. So we have to consider this. Since there's no estimate on the number of tenancies that were covered by the bill, and there is no buffer period, and then many businesses will have to repay the 3 months' rent in one go, which is a substantial sum. If that's the case, is it in line with the respecting the contract spirit, which is something that Hong Kong holds dear to, and I have a doubt about that. Now, during the Bills Committee meetings, I raised 2 points. First, landlords. The government has to do an estimate on the loss suffered by landlords as a result of the moratorium. Only then we could accurately assess the possible impact and effectiveness of the bill. And then second point, now the administration pointed out that many other countries with similar bill laws, but then I must point out in these other countries the government would offer other support measures, for example setting up conciliation teams or setting up a special tribunal to deal with disputes that may arise from the rental enforcement moratorium. For us, we're just going to enact a bill. There are no other support measures or follow-up measures. So after the 3 months protection period, there may be a surge in the number of litigation cases involving tenancies. So now the government should protect the interests of both landlords and tenants, and it must make preparation in advance, because there may be a surge in the number of court cases. So then if the government is well prepared, it could deal with that properly. And then also you will have to increase manpower in enforcing court judgments, such as the number of bailiffs. Now, when we considered the bill, I heard views from many small landlords and SME developers, and I have then proposed 2 amendments to the bill. One, for all the rates outgoings payable under the tenancy. For example, tenants may have to pay management fees under the tenancy, and then tenants will still have to pay all these outgoings before they are protected by the bill. That's what I proposed. Because otherwise, landlords won't have rental income at the same time. They would have to pay all these outgoings on behalf of the tenants. Second point, about barring banks from pursuing landlords in mortgage payment. I have also proposed amendment to the with the requirement that proof must be produced by landlords, because for the surety or guarantor of tenants, they don't have to prove anything, and they are protected by the bill, and landlords should be given the same treatment. Unfortunately, the Bills Committee did not give a majority support to my proposed amendments. Therefore, I do not plan to move these amendments in this council. Now, on the definition of rent, does it cover management fees and other outgoings? I sought clarification from the Financial Secretary's office, and the Financial Secretary's office gave me a detailed response on the 21st of April. I'm grateful for that. They confirmed that rent, the definition of rent, does not cover management fees or other outgoings paid to a third party. Now, for tenancies already entered into, and if it's stated that tenants may have to pay all the miscellaneous fees, and if tenants do not pay these fees in time, then the landlords could still take action during the protection period. Under these circumstances, tenants are not protected by the bill. I hope the government will explain this clearly to the public about the definition of rent, so both parties will know exactly what their rights and obligations are. Now, Hong Kong is an international financial center that respects the contractual spirit. If there are going to be a large number of litigation cases because of this, it will have a serious impact on Hong Kong. Now, we, with the 5th wave of the epidemic and the extended social distancing measures, many businesses are on the brink of collapse, and there are strong public grievances. So on this basis, I will support this bill. But I hope the government will explore other practical ways. For example, early resumption of quarantine-free travel to help businesses instead of resorting to such measures that is robbing the rich for the poor.
Mr. Lee Chin-kang. Thank you, Mr. President. In relation to the Financial Secretary's proposal of rental enforcement moratorium in the budget, it is a new measure that seeks to alleviate the burden of tenants. I believe this is a drastic measure for the drastic times, especially we are facing the unprecedented challenge as a result of the fifth wave of the epidemic. Many sectors of the economy are hit hard and many businesses have closed down. I understand, of course, the original intention of this moratorium is good. It seeks to help business tenants. However, I think there is more to be desired as far as the proposal is concerned, because for small landlords relying on rental income, they also face a lot of hardship. Now, at the district level, I got in touch with the public, and I've been serving Chai Wan constituency since 2020. Chai Wan is not a very rich district, and there are a lot of small shops. There are also some subdivided shops, so to speak, that retirees previously purchased at a very high price. These retired landlords spent their life savings on a small shop. They planned to rely on rental income to support the family and to pay for their medical expenses in the future. With this piece of legislation enacted, their livelihood would be affected. Some small landlords are concerned that they would not be able to recover rental income, and their major or only source of income would be deprived of. And in fact, during the epidemic, many small landlords already negotiated with business tenants on the rent reduction, and the reality is that there is no more room to cut rent further. Since announcement of the rental moratorium measure, tenants were given this blatant excuse as a trump card not to pay rent. So the small owners have told me about their plight and that they are very worried. They're worried that they will not be able to recover rent, management fees, utility charges, etc. Let me give you one example of the small landlord's concerns. For example, if a tenant is unable to pay rent for up to 2 months because of the epidemic, then under the rental enforcement moratorium arrangement, the tenant will be spared paying 3 months rent, or another 3 months rent. And during the period, if a new tenancy agreement can be entered into, meaning that if the landlord is willing to cut rent further, then the tenancy can be carved out of the application. In other words, the landlord is put into a very disadvantageous position. If there is no negotiation, the landlord will not be able to pursue rent from the tenants, and altogether there will be a rent payment default of 5 months. Although it is said that at the end of the protection period, landlords would still be able to pursue the rent in arrears, but in reality, the small landlords operate very differently from the consortia. At the time of signing tenancy agreements, they do not have the clout to demand business tenants to put up personal guarantee, unlike the major shopping mall developers. In other words, if a landlord decides to take the case to the court, he will have to pay for litigation and wait for a long time for the court to give judgment. if they do not have the means to take the matter to the court, that means they will never be able to recover rent, and the financial losses suffered by landlords would be very significant. What is even more worrying is that if the tenant decides not to rent the shop at all, the landlord will not be able to pay mortgage, and then the banks can take possession for mortgage default. Although it is said that the landlords can obtain interest-free loan capped at $100,000 equivalent to 3 months' rent under the 100% personal loan guarantee scheme. It is, after all, putting the cart before the horse. They are, after all, the lender, and all of a sudden they are the borrower. And at the end of the protection period, if the tenant then disappears, altogether the landlord will have to shoulder 7 months' rent, and they also bear the risk of the property being repossessed by the bank. And then there will be more such cases in the community. According to the government, at the Bills Committee meeting, this legislative proposal would only cause a delay of dunning debts for 3 months. But drawing on the reference of a similar act in Singapore, our neighboring city, their legislation operates in a different way. There is government commitment. In other words, they have different measures. For example, they have a subsidy for landlords, and apart from cash subsidy, they also allow tax breaks. And for micro and small micro establishments and SMEs, they also get 2 months rent waiver. And for business or office tenants, they have 1 month rent waiver. There is also a 25% tax rebate equivalent to 84,000 Hong Kong dollars. So I don't see any criticisms by people in Singapore on the internet. Of course, I understand that we're all facing a financial hardship, and this is a drastic measure in these drastic times. The legislative proposal, however, runs contrary to the free market principle. We also have the perception that we're taking away the right to private property. For landlords who are better off, even under these circumstances, they can reduce rent so that they can tide the tenants over difficulties. That's the government's explanation. But then there is no commitment on the part of the government, and it is unreasonable. I think that if we make a little more change to the proposal, we would be able to better safeguard the property of small landlords as well. My suggestion is this. First, only property with a rental value above $30,000 would be protected. Second, landlords with more than one property for rent will not be covered by the law. Third, banks should not repossess any property for mortgage default due to the tenants terminating the tenancy agreement until they get a new tenant. Number four, there should be a compulsory code requiring arrangements to be put in place for dunning rents in arrears, and the government should provide subsidy capped at a ceiling of several $10,000. I think that if the government is willing to adopt even some of my suggestions, it will give better protection to small owners, whilst abiding by the original intent of the bill. My concern is that this bill sets a bad precedent. When there is a natural disaster, or when there is another emergency, a similar piece of legislation may be enacted, and this will again give people the perception of depriving our right to private property. Lastly, I hope that this is a special measure for this epidemic, and I hope that it will not be repeated again. I have reservations about the bill. Next, Reverend Canon Peter Kuhn. Mr. President, first of all, I thank the government for resorting to every means to provide assistance to affected business tenants in this wave of the epidemic. But as I explained earlier, this bill is really tricky for the Legislative Council. Of course, there are good intentions as far as the bill is concerned. It provides a breathing space for the hard-hit business tenants, and that's the operation of the rental enforcement moratorium. Although some tenants may stand to benefit, the bill, after all, is something that undermines the well-established mechanism of protecting private property rights in Hong Kong. If this piece of legislation is enacted, it will allow the government to meddle with free market operation. On the contrary, if the bill is not passed, we will be regarded as neglecting the plight of SMEs. Of course, I welcome relief measures from the government to support SMEs affected by the epidemic. However, this bill runs contrary to the basic law's principle of private property rights. Article 6 of the Basic Law provides that there is such a right, and Article 105 provides that there is also protection for acquisition, use, and transfer of private property of enterprises and individuals or legal persons, and that if the property is acquired, reasonable compensation should be given. And if the tenant is unable to afford rent and therefore runs away, landlords will bear a loss equivalent to 3 months' rent. I have to ask whether this is fair. On the other hand, the government should not be simple-minded to believe that only SMEs will be affected. Other members of society would also be affected, just like landlords. Many landlords rely on rental income to pay for mortgage. There are also elderly owners relying or living off on rental income. So it's a breach of the contractual spirit, and it's also an invasion of private property rights. Although the government at the Bills Committee meeting cited examples of legislation similar to this one overseas, the legislation in other countries are not the same. Take UK as an example. During the epidemic, in order to safeguard the interests of business tenants and prevent people from becoming street sleepers, in the end of March 2020, the UK introduced an act preventing eviction of tenants for rent default. It applies to both tenants and landlords. 18 months after the act had been put in place, the rent in arrears amounted to £6.4 billion. It's such a staggering sum. And if landlords then began to pursue rent in arrears, there could be a lot of enterprises going bust. The government had no other way but to allow landlords and tenants to negotiate afresh the rental agreement, and as a result, the interests of landlords were sacrificed. Although the bill will lapse in 3 months after commencement, we must not ignore the far-reaching implications of the bill and the unfairness it creates to different strata of society. It also puts landlords and tenants against each other. In order to tide them over difficulties, another way should be developed instead of using this complex bill. For example, we should extend the short-term financing guarantee scheme to help SMEs with liquidity problems. So I think that if we only have this measure for a few months, it's not worth it.
Mr. Rock Chan, let me declare my interest. My company is a landlord. I will be affected by this bill. The Financial Secretary in this year's budget introduces rental enforcement moratorium so that the designated industries will be given a 3 month protection period from rental enforcement. After consulting the public, the industries and some legislative members decided to move some amendments and enhance the bill. The RAB will like to recognize the government's effort for its willingness to amend this bill. However, there are still some concerns and doubts which they hope to express on their behalf. Let me cite one example. At the end of the 3 months protection period, that some of the commercial tenants at the start of the 4th month may still continue to fail to pay their rent, and the landlord will start taking action on the 4th month. However, these tenants may still fail to meet the rent on the 5th and the 6th months. From the issuing of the legal letter and finally given the right to re-entry, it would take about 6 or 9 months. If the tenants apply for a petition for bankruptcy or winding up application, after deducting 3 months of deposit, the landlord will be on the hook of 6 months of losses. If what I said becomes a reality, I hope that the court will expedite the bailiff procedures and able to minimize the landlord losses. Second, the government's policy did compromise the sanctity of contracts. Hong Kong has always taken the sanctity of the contracts and the protection of private property. Even though we're all aware that due to COVID-19, a lot of the tenants has exhausted their cash flows and may be deeply in debt. Then the government decided to launch these special arrangements in this extraordinary period, so that for the 17 premises covered by the AEF and to provide a breathing room for them, which may benefit 130,000 commercial tenants. I hope that the tenants and the landlord can negotiate together and able to achieve a rental concession agreement. From this month on, since the government gradually eased the social distancing measures, they can have their business back on track. This is a timely relief. At the height of the pandemic, they will manage to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The legislative intent is understandable. A lot of the conscientious landlords, upon the appeal by the financial secretaries and understanding the tenants' dilemma, are willing to offer rate concessions. The intent of this bill is to make the landlord and the tenants to ride out the storm together, so that the SMEs can continue to operate without having to need to close down or layoffs, which might push up the unemployment rate. As I said, this temporary protection measures was introduced as extraordinary or especially challenging period. However, this has been compromising the long-established contract spirit. I hope this is just a one-off measure and will not launch this market intervention measures in the future. And finally, at the height of the pandemic, this bill is to safeguard jobs and enterprises. In its implementation, this should not put the responsibility squarely on the landlords. This is not fair to them. Every party has its own problems. While trying to save the tenants, you need to understand the landlord's difficulty and try to minimize the losses to the landlords. I hope that the government can take a greater commitment that by having a tripartite responsibility. While helping the tenants, the government should consider reduce the losses to the landlords. For example, they could help the old rent can be used to offset some of the rates and also offer rent subsidy to the tenants. As some of the members said before me, the Singapore government has provided support to the small landlords that in certain situations, if the landlords come to financial difficulty due to early lease termination, it can apply compensation from the government. These measures not only can maintain the landlord's income, but also help the tenants from have the rent chased. I so submit. Next, Mr. Kenneth Falk. President, I declared interest. I worked for a company which owns some properties, and some of them are leased to the affected industries, for example, F&B outlets. This temporary protection measures for business tenants, the intent is clear. The government had hoped that all sectors can stand united to ride the storm together. Well, for this innovative measure, I think he deserves a credit, and I will support it as well. I should take this opportunity to speak for my constituents. I would like to tell the secretary of our current situation. The sector, about 70% of them are SMNEs. Recently, I've talked to them. We all feel that this measure is better than none and would help some of them to catch some breathing space. Well, in the budget speech, he mentioned that after the protection period, he might consider extending for another 3 months. If so, that it may offer greater relief to my constituents. Nevertheless, the extender option has been abandoned, and my constituents express disappointment. I also understand that rationale against it. I understand we need to balance the interests of all sides. Therefore, this extender option is now removed. I understand how it came about. As I said at the BC stage, this measure can really may be limited in terms of the effort to support industry. As the core concern of the constituents that at the end of the extended protection period, they will hope to enforce or seek the overdue rent with interest. Now that the economy has reopened since 21st of April, it's just about 1 week. Well, the gym operators have told me, well, despite the crowds, the revenue has yet to come in. In a few months, they will still repaying their debt. We have a lot of customers simply spending or burning out their packages. And so far, there may not be a lot of new revenue or cash flow coming in. While the performing sector, even though the venues have reopened, a lot of them are yet to able to operate. As you know, the performances need time for rehearsals and ticket sales and so on. Well, theaters and playhouses, the 50% attendance cap make them hardly profitable. A lot of me told me that for 50% attendance cap, they rather not stage any performance. Well, in order to make it profitable, to make up for the 3 months of lost revenue is quite hard. At the end of the 3 months protection period, where there will be another wave of closures, the jury is still out at this stage. On Mr. Leung's proposed amendments, especially on Class 5.4a and 7.1bi, that to defer the commencement date from 1st of January 2022 to the commencement date of the ordinance, I have reservations. If his amendment is passed, well, this bill itself will be rendered futile and could not help those who have been closed since the 7th January 2022. Therefore, I will not support Mr. Leung's amendments. We understand this is a one-off extraordinary measure, and to help to small medium enterprises affected, and also to need to balance the structural impact to the private enterprises. We can take things, for example, by providing subsidy on rental concession or rent waiver will be a good compromise. Well, I will not elaborate, as a lot of members have provided divergent views for the government's reference. I hope that the government can undertake a study. We don't have a crystal ball that when this pandemic will have the next few waves. If it happens, I hope the government will not let a repeat of the previous wave closures. I so submit.
Mr. Tony Chair. Thank you, President. I speak in support of the temporary protection measures for business tenants COVID-19 pandemic bill. That is the so-called rental enforcement moratorium bill. Now, in the fifth wave of the epidemic, various social distancing measures were tightened. There was no dine-in service at night, and we see few people in shopping malls. Many eating establishments were suffering. Now, of course, the pandemic has been going on for 2 years, and then in the fourth wave of the epidemic, when it eased, there was a relaxation of social distancing measures, and there was a hope that there would be some sort of cross-boundary travel. So some businesses decided to set up new restaurants, and they did all the renovation and so on. But then when they opened, the fifth wave hit, and they had no choice but to close down. Although they were reluctant, of course, the employers suffer, the employees suffered as well, because it doesn't matter how hard they work, they become unemployed and have no income. For landlords of shopping mall units, they also suffer. Now, it takes them time to recover their premises, and then they have to renovate the place before they can let it out, and they don't know how long they have to wait for another tenant. And then the new rental level probably may not be as high as that before. And in large shopping malls, the landlords are worried that there will be a large number of businesses closing down, so there are many vacant units in the shopping mall, and few people will come and visit. And even after the pandemic, and even if there's resumption of cross-boundary travel, landlords may do more publicity, but the shopping mall may not be as popular as before. So that's why the administration is proposing this bill to impose a rental enforcement moratorium on landlords. Now, the sector, the constituents I represent have divergent views, but personally, I'm inclined to support this bill because for businesses that are suffering, they will have a few months of breathing space. It will help them to tide over, and also we could keep jobs. And then for the hard-hit tenants, this bill is actually a way to encourage landlords to come to agreement with tenants on rental concessions. Some criticize that the bill has hurt the free market operation here and the rule of law. But then these measures are not invented by the SL government. In other countries such as the UK, Singapore, and Australia, the governments there have rolled out similar measures, although those measures cover different targets. And in any case, this bill is just about a moratorium on recovering rent. It's not about waiving rents. So after the protection period, landlords still have the right to recover all rents in arrears. And then there's a sunset clause in the bill too. So it's 3 months from the gazettal of the bill. So there should be the impact on investors' confidence should be acceptable in that sense. Now, would the measure encourage tenants to default on rent payment? Now, I've dealt with some leasing business involving shopping malls before, and I've come across cases that the tenants default on rent payment, and then landlords have to pursue the rent, and then the landlords just run away. So there are such cases. So without this bill, there will be tenants like that. So what is important is for landlords to be careful in selecting tenants, and they must make sure there is proper guarantee. If we're talking about normal tenants, if their business is not hard hit by the pandemic, and because the bill only offers a moratorium on rent recovery instead of waiving rents, and so I don't think many people would actually default on rent payments, because for those who could afford to pay rent, they have already invested heavily into the refurbishment and other facilities on the premises, but because of the pandemic, their business suffer. So this bill would give them some support. Then we will be able to reduce the number of business closures and also, dismissal of staff. Now, some landlords live off rental income. They worry this bill may affect their livelihood, and then the banks may actually try to repossess the unit if they fail to pay the mortgage payment. But then for these landlords, if they have borrowed excessively, then whether there's this bill, they will still have to face the consequence that the economy has been badly hit by the pandemic, and so rental income also suffers. They can't expect the government to bail them out. Now, there are other landlords who say that they are prepared to, there are others who say that some landlords were prepared to offer rent concession, but because of the bill, they would refuse to negotiate further. Well, it doesn't make sense. Because in the bill there's a clause that if landlords and tenants could enter into a new agreement, then they could contract out of the bill. But if landlords refuse to offer rent concession, then businesses may close down, and so both parties end up suffering loss. So we hope landlords and tenants will be understanding, and then hopefully tenants are able to tide over this tough time, and then there could be good long-term relationship between tenants and landlords after amicable negotiation. Now, the bill will bring about positive impact in Hong Kong, and also the government has agreed to consider various protection measures. Therefore, on the whole, I think the bill deserves our support. The fifth wave of the epidemic has hit us fast and hard. I hope it will also ease soon. With the support of the central authorities and the effort of the public, we have now come down from the peak of some 20,000 cases a day to just a few hundred cases a day. Now, there's also relaxation of social distancing measures. Evening dining services resumed. Cinemas, fitness centers, beauty parlors could reopen. And then we see packed shopping malls and restaurants again. So for businesses that have been affected by the epidemic, I hope business will resume very quickly, recover very quickly, and they're able to repay the rent in arrears, and they don't need to rely on the protection under the bill. I hope, more importantly, that there won't be another major outbreak of an epidemic, so that we will never again need to see a bill like this. Thank you. Dr. Tik Chi Yin. Well, the third side supports this bill. That is the rental enforcement moratorium. This will give some breathing space to tenants, in particular SME tenants. And also, there is an opportunity for landlords and tenants to have positive exchanges and interactions. But then some may say this is not in line with the established principles. But if the government needs to act, it has to do so. I think for this bill, it struck the right balance. Then Financial Secretary I think this bill, yes, could offer some help, but it doesn't really address the root cause of the problem. Because this is just about delaying payment of rent. It doesn't mean rent doesn't have to be paid. Now, when the epidemic comes under control and we resume to normalcy, I believe many landlords and tenants, landlords are able, and tenants are able to, tide over this tough time. But if there's another outbreak, then for tenants, they will be under heavy burden to have to pay the rent in arrears and so on. So I think what is important is about putting the epidemic under control. The fifth wave of the epidemic is a very painful lesson for us. I hope the government will be forward-looking. It will be able to foresee where there will be risks and where there may be difficulties, and then they will come up ways to deal with that. And then more importantly, there has to be better departmental coordination. Now, if we could put the epidemic under control, then I think this bill will have a positive effect. So I support the bill proposed by the administration, and I'm against the amendments to be moved by Mr. Louis Leung.
Mr. Frankie Yik. Mr. President, the fifth wave of the COVID-19 epidemic started in the beginning of this year, and it continued to rage rapidly with escalating number of confirmed cases. The government then tightened social distancing measures. Apart from banning dinner dining service and restricting 2 persons per table, many scheduled premises were also ordered to close, and many business premises suffered losses. To avoid massive layoffs and business closures, the government rolled out the employment support scheme and temporary unemployment relief, as well as the bill we see today. We understand the plight facing operators of scheduled premises. I agree that support should be given. Rental expenses form a significant portion of business expenses. The government, therefore, puts forward the legislative proposal with a rental enforcement moratorium barring landlords from taking action against business tenants affected by the epidemic and hence unable to pay rent on time. This is out of good intention, but then it interferes with the free market principle. It also goes against the rights of private ownership of property in the basic law. In fact, in this dire business environment, the business sector has been frozen, and there are many empty shop spaces, as you can see in the street. I believe landlords will be able to renegotiate rental terms with the tenants. The chief executive at one point make a public appeal for landlords to cut rent, and many landlords of shops followed. And then, according to some small landlords, they relied on rental income to pay for mortgage, and they're concerned that banks may repossess their property for mortgage default. There are also retirees living off on rental income, expressing their concerns that their livelihood will be affected. And on the basis of these concerns, the government refined the legislative proposal. For example, the Hong Kong MA should issue a circular reminding banks to exercise discretion on cases involving landlords unable to pay mortgage because of rent default. And in fact, this has been incorporated in the bill. Landlords are barred from taking such legal action, or else it would be an offense. However, this is only a transmission of the problem from business tenants to landlords, even to banks. It goes against the bank's lending policy and the spirit of loans. As far as livelihood problems and cash flow problems of small owners, according to the government, under the 100% personal loan guarantee scheme, an interest-free loan equivalent to 3 months' rent would be offered to small owners, capped at $100,000. Still, this is illogic because the protection periods actually last for more than 3 months. Because of the rental moratorium, small landlords are unable to make ends meet and pay for mortgage. In the end, these owner borrowers are required to take out loans from banks. Although, according to the government's explanation, it's just a delay of rent payment, not cutting rent once and for all, then why can't you provide loan to tenants instead for them to pay rent? Why are we taking such a detour for loans to be offered to owners instead? Although the government has removed the option of a further extension of 3 months so that at the end of the protection period, at the end of the rental moratorium, it won't be extended for 3 months. Even if the bill is passed today, any action to be taken by landlords starting the 1st of January will have to be suspended. And together with the 3 months counting from the start of May, altogether there will be rent in arrears for up to 7 months. And other members also echoed with this suggestion. For landlords who are unable to recover rent for 7 months, the amount is not insignificant. Even if landlords are able to recover rent at the end of the protection period, given the current business environment, tenants are unable to pay all the rent in arrears in one go. And if tenants then run away, landlords will suffer even a greater loss. By then, who will help these landlords? The government should provide more support. At least there should be measures to ensure that owners of shops will be able to recover rent. In Australia, they have a compulsory code requiring landlords and tenants to renegotiate on the rental terms of the shop space, including paying the rent in arrears by installment. In Hong Kong, however, the government only demands voluntary negotiation between the two parties. So the buck is passed to the landlords. At the end of the day, owners of business premises bear all the brunt. Now, according to the government, the purpose is to provide breathing space, but the government doesn't make any commitment. The government is generous at the expense of others. I have no alternative but to go for the one with lesser harm, and that is Mr. Leung's amendment. We should restrict the application of the bill to SMEs because they're in a plight, and that the commencement date should be limited to 3 months after commencement in order to minimize the damage to landlords. I hope that this is a one-off exercise so that we can truly respect the well-established principles and that we should remain unchanged for 50 years. I need to declare that I work for one of the property developers in Hong Kong. So I submit, Mr. Lai Tong Kwok. Mr. President, we all know that the fifth wave of the epidemic was raging fast, and when you went to see a doctor, the doctor told you that there was no special drugs to treat COVID, and we only had Panadol for you to for your temperature to come down. So you rely on your own immune system to recover, and that's exactly what the financial secretary is doing. We're talking about the epidemic affecting every sector of the economy, not just small landlords, but all landlords and all sectors of the community and everyone. So in this difficult situation, it is not easy at all to come up with this bill to provide breathing space. And like many members have said, this bill could be regarded as running contrary to the contractual principle and as enshrined in the Basic Law. And this is no small matter. However, we also need to bear in mind the plight our citizens are in, and we need to come up with something to help them. I really appreciate the Financial Secretary for his commitment and his resolve in putting forward this bill, and his candor in seeking views from all sectors of the economy after the bill has been floated. Well, this bill is far from perfect. It's not a panacea to every problem. And of course, there is always room for improvement. There are bold steps to be taken in order to make improvements. But then, the biggest problem is we have only limited time. There is so much time, just so much time for us to give them the breathing space. Well, after the 21st of April, everyone would see how shopping malls are becoming crowded again. But of course, it will take time for everybody to fully recover because COVID-19 virus causes something called long COVID. It cannot be treated overnight with just one pill. What is important, however, is that after passage of the bill, we'll be given breathing space. Well, if a business tenant is unable to pay rent at the end of the day, he will go bankrupt anyway. And a landlord who may not survive after all. But then we will be given the chance to hold on to it for a bit longer. And when the times improve, there will be light at the end of the tunnel. In fact, many landlords, after the bill has been floated, have approached the tenants for renegotiating the tenancy so that we can carve out the application of the bill, which is good. In fact, there have been calls over the past 2 years for landlords to reduce rent in order to help tenants without much result. The bill is effective. Of course, we have a common law system and we need to respect the basic law and also the spirit of the contract in the common law system. However, similarly, we also have the legislature in Hong Kong. If it is of the executive's opinion that the common law principles of the common law system should be revised by way of enacting legislation, then the executive must involve the legislature in terms of passage of a bill. Now, there is a sunset clause in the bill. The bill will lapse in 3 months. The Financial Secretary originally proposed 6 months, but having heeded the views of others, he revised the proposal and limit the protection period to 3 months so as to strike a balance between different sectors and to cater for the interests of all. Financial Secretary, I really appreciate your effort in listening to our views and make amendments to the bill. It's not perfect, but I'm going to support it, Mr. President.
Professor Sun Dong. Thank you, President. First, I would like to express support for the temporary protection measures for business tenants COVID pandemic bill. This is introduced in wake of the severe disruption brought by the fifth wave pandemic. It has its urgency to preserve our economic vitality while protecting industries, for example, tourism, food and beverage, and retail industries employees is one of the top overriding demands. In face of major social controversy, we need to resolve the conflicts. We need to maintain the overall economic stability. That's why the main reason of supporting this bill. For quite some time, I have been talking to big and small business owners. I understand their aspirations. I'd like to thank the Financial Secretary that upon extensive consultations, including the business and companies and other owners, and made some amendments. Upon the passage of this bill, that can truly help those in need and preserve our economy. Even though this bill is not perfect, however, its merits overcome its drawbacks. At this extraordinary period, that the minority should support the majority. Its successful implementation would rely on the cooperation between the landlords, the government, and the tenants. In terms of the tenants, and all three parties have interest in keeping the business alive. Well, I hope that both sides can enter a new rental agreement to create a harmonious business environment. That will be a benefit to Hong Kong. The implementation must lie on avoiding the both sides relations deteriorated due to this bill. What I don't want to see that happen, that upon this bill implementation, there's still a lot of business being closed, and the landlords still not able to recover the rent and suffered huge losses. For this, the government has a duty to step up supervision, while the industries would maintain try to save their reputation. Just imagine, upon the launch of this bill, not only it couldn't help to reserve economy and save the jobs, instead, it might lead to lots of lawsuits. Will the government launch out similar relief measures in the future? And finally, I wish to point out, those objecting to this bill, not just the real estate developers or small landlords, will also include all walks of life. While there are two grounds of their objections. First, they see this bill may create a bad precedent. They may undermine the free market principles, undermining Hong Kong's prosperity. Second, a lot of people worries that that may be expanded to private residential units and also be infringing on private property rights. I suggest that the government must do more explanation to the public, at the same time taking concrete action to allay these people's concern. President, I so submit. Ms. Eunice Young. President, I would like to make some suggestions and share my observation on this bill. This bill was first mentioned in the 2022-23 budget speech. Well, barring the tenants, let's say for a period of 3 months, from terminating the tenancy or suspending provision of services or taking other related legal actions against the business tenants of specified sectors for failing to settle right and schedule for a short period. I understand that the government would need to balance the interests of the landlords and the tenants, and as well as their obligations. At the BC stage, which I'm a member, I heard views from the members, well, including myself, as for whether this will protect the tenants and the landlords' interests. in terms of free market principles and the impact to the private property rights and the sanctity of contracts, the financial secretary had briefed us before the Bills Committee stage. Note that in face of the severe pandemic, this is an extreme measure and should be just one-off. I understand the government perspective. Some landlords have told us, even just as a one-off relief measure, how to deal with the actual losses incurred. Well, I'd like to take this time to relay the landlord's concern or offer a counter suggestion to the FS. This landlord said, the rent reduction but no rental moratorium can help the SMEs for those who own more than 3 months, another 3 months of rental recovery moratorium. And when the tenants decide to flood, then the tenants would be on the hook for all the losses. And while it hire a lawyer and cost money to recover the lost rent, and probably quite unlikely, while the banks will chase the landlords for the payment, while they could have right of re-entry or forfeit the property. Well, I try to analyze the situation, and I heard from the explanation from the administration, and we tried to explain the intent of this bill. After many sittings, we finally understand that we hope that landlords can reduce their rent so that they'll be on the same boat as the tenants, while able to receive rent, able to help this small tenants. They finally understand, after much explanation, and understand that this bill does not really target the small landlords. As well, some of the small landlords came with their own suggestion. They hope that the government, or actually the landlord, or the tenants to make a choice. Finally, the moratorium for the specified industry from 3 to 6 months. However, the tenants with personal or security guarantee make sure they're able to meet the rent in full after the lapse of the protection period. For the rental guarantee during the protection period, if the tenant is not able to pay the rent, the government is willing to guarantee 80% of the rent owed. And finally, if the tenants refuse the payment moratorium and able to get a rent relief for full payment of the rent, and through a negotiation to can negotiate with the landlord, and hopefully that there will be concession on turnover rent or special rental concessions, and also support by the landlords who are willing to negotiate rental concessions by offering extra subsidy. This will really address the concerns of the small landlords, so that they will not regard this bill as being damaging to interest. And I see the government has been acting very sincerely and listened to the views of the members and proposed a number of enhancements. For example, shortening the protection period from 3 months and without the 3-month extender. And there will also have the security enforcement moratorium for some of the less well-off tenants. And in the future, if the 6th wave is to arrive, I hope that you can listen more to the smaller landlords. For example, whether the government should provide support to them. At the BC meetings, I proposed to the FS and whether there will be some rent tax incentives for the landlords to encourage rental concessions, so the landlords will not feel as victims. I understand this bill is not targeting the landlords and not targeting the smaller landlords. It's just hope that we can balance the interests of all sides to figure a way out together, which will help to safeguard jobs and we're really about the welfare of the whole population. Therefore, I support this temporary protection measures for business tenants COVID-19 pandemic bill. But we need to help people. We need to do our utmost. Therefore, I'm not able to support Mr. Lung's amendments. Next, Mr. Louis Lung. Mr. President, I would like to declare.
Now, I would like to declare I'm a member of the Real Estate Developer Association, and some of the members of the association are landlords. Now, the government has heeded our concerns, and then they have removed the bill to allow for an extension of 3 months of the protection period. Welcome that, but then I must stress that in principle I'm against using legislative means to intervene into private contracts, even if it's a temporary measure in extraordinary times. It would inevitably undermine Hong Kong's reputation as an international financial center. The government said that such temporary protection measures through legislative means is not something novel. Similar measures have been implemented in overseas jurisdictions such as the UK, Singapore, and Australia in 2020. But I must point out, for all these other places, they have also rolled out support measures at the same time to help landlords and tenants to formulate repayment schedules and provide other support measures. For example, in Australia, landlords and tenants have to follow a mandatory code in negotiation. There has to be arrangement for repayment of default rent by installment, and then there are also other measures to deal with disputes between landlords and tenants in Australia. And then in the UK, in March this year, they passed a new act to bring in binding adjudication process. This is to help landlords and tenants to deal with rents in arrears. As for Singapore, as a number of members explained the arrangement, so I'm not going to repeat that. But if we look at Hong Kong, the administration has not come up with any support measures as a result of the bill. When the bill is passed and becomes law, then the effect is that tenants will just be, delaying the payment of rent, and then this default rent will accrue. And when the protection period is over, tenants may not be able to afford to repay the rent, and then the landlords will have to bear all the loss. So there are two fundamental flaws in the bill. First of all, the bill has departed from the legislative intent to help SMEs. Secondly, the protection period is actually far longer than 3 months in effect. Now, on departing from the legislative intent to help SMEs, in paragraph 117 of the bill, of the budget, the Financial Secretary said, and I quote, many SMEs currently face huge challenge amidst the adverse business environment. So the emphasis is SMEs here. Taking into consideration the rental payment constitutes a major part of the operating expenses of enterprises, we will expeditiously introduce new legislation to prohibit landlords from terminating the tenancy of or not providing services to tenants of specified sectors for failing to settle rents on the schedule for a period of 3 months. And then at the special meeting of the Finance Committee on the 24th of February, in the opening remarks, the Financial Secretary stressed once again he wants to help SMEs in facing huge challenge. He wants to give breathing space to SMEs. So he said we would legislate to prohibit landlords from terminating the tenancy of or not providing services to tenants of specified sectors for failing to settle rents on schedule for a period of 3 months. In the Legislative Council brief, paragraph 4, the government points out that rent is a substantial part of the operating expenses of SMEs. So that's why there is this legislative proposal to impose a moratorium on rental enforcement. So it's in the budget, it's in the opening remarks of Financial Secretary, and is in the Legislative Council brief. It shows that the original intent is to offer protection to SMEs, not all business tenants. But then, regrettably, at the Bills Committee meetings, the government repeatedly denied that the bill is meant for SMEs. And when I proposed my amendments at the meeting on the 31st of March, the government said there's actually no distinction between SMEs and the larger companies. Now, I must point out the application scope of the bill is too extensive. There are large enterprises whose business has not been affected by the epidemic, and they're covered too, and so that's a departure from the legislative intent. That's why I see the need to amend the bill and include the definition for SMEs. On the protection period being longer than 3 months in effect. Now, the legislative intent of the administration is to offer 3 months of protection because of the fifth wave of the epidemic. So, therefore, the time should start counting from the commencement of the bill for a period of 3 months. But then, in the bill, the relevant period is set as the 1st of January 2022. That's the commencement. So even if there's no retrospective effect of the bill back to the 1st of January, this clause actually gives it retrospective effect to the bill. So the protection period proposed by the Financial Secretary is in effect extended from 3 months to some 7 or 8 months. That's a substantial extension, and that certainly is a departure from the legislative intent of offering a 3-month protection period. At the Bills Committee meetings and in the administration's written reply to my proposed amendments, the administration pointed out that the bill would only commence on the date of Gazetto, and there is no retrospective commencement date. Now, the government just focuses on the commencement of the bill, and it overlooks the fact that the protection period is actually substantially extended from 3 months to some 7 to 8 months, and I find that baffling. That's why I see a need to amend the bill, so the bill could faithfully reflect the legislative intent of a 3-month protection period. Thank you. Mr. Kwok Wai Kang. Thank you. I'm a member of the Bills Committee on the Temporary Protection Measures for Business Tenants COVID-19 Pandemic Bill. I'm also the representative of FTU, and I'm speaking in those capacities. Now, in these are extraordinary times. The Financial Secretary is prepared to take extraordinary measures to help SMEs to tide over the tough time, and we support that. And then, with the pandemic, no one could be left out. And this is a time for us to join hands to tide over this tough time. Now, for landlords who are prepared to offer rent concession, we will commend them. But at the same time, there are still landlords who refuse to offer rent concession. And it is not uncommon. And some of these are actually major consortium. And so if you think we can do nothing about that, I believe then this bill will be an incentive for landlords and tenants to enter into new tenancies. That means they will still respect the sanctity of the contract and continue with the tenancy. Now, the 21st of April is a good day because that's when social distancing measures are relaxed, there's a resumption of evening dining service and many other business operations. And then the electric consumption voucher will help to stimulate spending and keep jobs. It's last year that we last dined out. So during the New Year, Chinese New Year, Easter, these should be peak spending seasons, but then there's no business because of the epidemic. And then, of course, there's a cumulative effect of the pandemic and so on, and that's why many businesses and workers are suffering. The Financial Secretary proposes to legislate for rental enforcement moratorium. In the second reading of the bill, the Financial Secretary said the intention of the government is to prevent large-scale business closures and loss of jobs. So these are extraordinary measures in extraordinary times. It shows that the government is prepared to find a solution, and we support that. So when the FTU will vote in support of the resumption of the second reading of the bill and the third reading of the bill. Now, as a member representing the labour sector, I always tell businesses that employers and employees are not necessarily pitched against each other. Often they're in the same boat. They have to work together for the benefit of both parties. And if there are business closures, of course, it's not just employers who are affected. There will be loss of jobs leading to a wave of unemployment. And with unemployment, spending power comes down. So this is a vicious circle. I'm sure we don't want to see that. Now, during the epidemic, I've been helping the sports sector often, and the sector tells us that over 100 fitness centers have closed, and many employees have lost their livelihood. And then there was a study conducted by Redfern Association. From 80 to 90% of those in the trade are either on no pay leave or on reduced pay. And then there are small gyms, they rent their own premises, they are not allowed to open, but they still have to pay rent when they have no income. So they may have to remortgage their own homes, or they have to sell their homes, they have to exhaust all their life savings just to pay rent. So the rental enforcement moratorium would really help small operators much. Now, some may question that this is against this is intervention of the free market operation, and it's also and the sanctity of contract. But actually, there is a contract out arrangement. If landlords and tenants are prepared to enter into new tenancy agreements, then they could contract out of the bill. So that's actually a way to encourage and to give bargaining power to tenants so they could renegotiate the tenancies with their landlords. At the same time, this is not a bill to remove the obligations of tenants, but rather it's just deferring the obligation to pay rent. Now, we know that epidemic is merciless. There are few solutions or ways out of this plight. Both landlords, tenants, and employees want a way out. So let's hope that this bill will have certain effect at this critical time, and it's only for a short term of 3 months. Rent, of course, is a major part of operating cost. For example, for retail businesses, rent accounts for close to 40% of operating costs. As for other service in trades, rent accounts for some 25% of the operating costs. Of course, not all landlords are prepared to cut rent. But of course, the better way is for the government to talk to the major real estate developers and associations, so landlords will proactively offer rent concession. And then for MSMEs, they will be given further breathing space. At the start of the pandemic in 2020, I actively approached the various real estate developers, large consortium, and landlords. I proposed a 6+6 rent arrangement to help with SMMC. At the time, Hong Kong was still affected by the Black Cloud riots, so the operation was not. Not many people paid attention to this campaign, but then the objective was to keep jobs, and some responded to the campaign. Some consortia were willing to talk to tenants to reduce rent, but then they refused to make public the arrangement because they worried it would affect their performance. And so that's why we couldn't, mobilize everyone to help businesses at the time. Well, actually, when landlords repossess the units, that doesn't mean they can rent the units out soon, so they still lose out on rental income. Now, last month, it was pointed out that in the popular shopping districts like Causeway Bay, Tsim Sha Tsui, and so on, some 10% of the shopping premises are left vacant. So you can see landlords actually end up suffering more loss. So if a big landlord still want to keep rental levels high, or because they're listed companies, they need to make sure they have good performance, and they don't care about the vicious circle, and at the end everyone loses out, well then they will suffer, and then we don't think that's a good thing. Now, initially, the government has the plan to extend the 3 months period for another 3 months if necessary. But then, because there are divergent views, so at the end, the bill only provides for a 3 months protection period, and the commencement date is set as the 1st of January. After you believe 3 plus 3 is actually acceptable, but now the government has stated its position. It will just proceed with the 3-month proposal because we don't want there to be more controversy, and so that would delay this bill. So that's why we just proceed with this first. For the government's amendments to extend the coverage of the bill to cover food factories, factory canteens, and so on, we support that. We want to help more businesses as far as possible. Now, the protection period is only for 3 months, so I'm worried that after the protection period, what the situation would be like. I hope the government will make plans for that. We all have a good idea what may happen. Now, even with the easing of social distancing measures and business picks up, and SMEs may decide not to close down, but that doesn't mean they are able to make enough money to make up for the loss. So the government needs to review this bill as soon as possible, and it should come up with a plan to prevent massive unemployment with business closures. And then the government should take a parallel approach. So it has to save the economy, to save businesses, have to keep jobs as well. Thank you.
Mr. Holden Chow. Mr. President, I speak in support of the Temporary Protection Measures for Business Tenants COVID-19 Pandemic Bill. I need to give the Financial Secretary a like, so to speak, because I think he's courageous in proposing this bill. Now, Hong Kong has all along been abiding by the principle of free market, and this bill easily gives off this perception of the government's interference with the free market. So this is a very serious crime, so to speak. But at the moment, we also understand we're facing a significant crisis under the current pandemic, and that calls for an extraordinary measure. So I need to commend the Financial Secretary for his courage to table this bill into the Council. Now, let me turn to the content of the bill. I think we should explore some of the provisions during this stage of resuming second reading. At the Bills Committee, I raised certain questions. Now, I understand that when the bill was first floated, there were concerns. For example, like I said just now, whether the executive would be meddling with the business sector, and there was also another concern about delaying the dunning of rental in arrears instead of having rent concessions. And then the financial secretary strived to strike a balance. I remember when the bill was first floated, he categorically refers to how landlords and tenants, new tenancy can carve out of the application of the bill, and that is as long as they reach some agreement. Now, this is one incentive to encourage landlords and tenants in reaching a new agreement. And that's exactly the feedback I've received. More landlords and tenants have been willing to negotiate rent reduction arrangements. And I think this bill somewhat, therefore, has achieved its purpose. At the Bills Committee, I also asked this question. Why isn't it included in the bill? For example, by how much or by what percentage should the rent reduction be? For example, rent should be reduced by 20 or 30% before the new tenancy is carved out of the application of the moratorium. And according to the government's reply, it has to balance the views of different stakeholders. And if we set such indicators, there may be further comments from different sectors and unnecessary disputes. There may be, for example, bickering over whether it should be 20% or 30%, and that the bickering could just go on and on. And after all, this bill seeks to provide imminent relief to those in need, especially SMEs. So I accept the government's explanation. The other point is this. Now, just now, like I mentioned, if at the end of the day there is no rent reduction to speak of, and that you're only delaying the rent payment, then according to some, after 3 months, you have to pay all the rent in arrears after all, and the amount would be quite significant. Like other members said just now, the essence of the bill is a breathing space. The bill seeks to provide SMEs in trouble with breathing space. In other words, when the SMEs have been hit so hard during the fifth wave of the epidemic, and that their businesses have almost come to a standstill, all they need is a breathing space so as to tie them over the difficulty. And I think the financial secretary is very familiar with it. That's the same principle for, say, the 100% personal loan guarantee scheme and other initiatives. Just like the SME financing guarantee scheme, we provide concessionary measures for SMEs, not for them to not repay loan, but to allow them to pay them later. So we're giving them breathing space for them to hang on. And if we take this perspective, we will understand that we should definitely support this bill. And finally, my last comment is that I have carefully listened to Mr. Louis Long's proposed amendment. He wants to restrict the application of the bill to SMEs only. But if I may, my comment is that the administration at the same time is proposing another amendment to expand the coverage so as to cover food factories, etc. Now let me give you this example. We see some franchise restaurants in Hong Kong providing so many jobs to grassroots, and rental expenses can break their backs when they try to keep jobs for the grassroots. So we're grateful, and we want to give support to frontline grassroots workers in these restaurants as well. So just to be clear, this is our position, and that is why I'm afraid I cannot support Mr. Long's amendment. However, we're going to support the administration's proposed amendment. When the epidemic was at its peak, we received a lot of concerns expressed by grassrooters. They were in dire straits. They couldn't make ends meet because they lost their jobs. So I think this is a common refrain. To actually help them, we should allow SMEs to survive in their business so that there are jobs for the people. Well, of course, the government should provide support, but more importantly, we should provide the prerequisite for the economy to revive, for us to resume economic activity so as to benefit all strata of society. I so submit. Dr. Loy Kwok. Mr. President, I speak in support of the Temporary Protection Measures for Business Tenants COVID-19 Pandemic Bill. The object of the bill is very clear. The bill seeks to provide short-term protection to business tenants affected by the fifth wave of the epidemic. Mr. President, we abide by the free market principle in Hong Kong. Although the bill is an extraordinary measure during extraordinary times, it is perceived to be going against this principle. After Chinese New Year, the fifth wave emerged and the government tightened the social distancing measures drastically, affecting different sectors of the economy, and many SMEs were struggling. Rental expenses accounted for a significant portion of SME's business expenses. So the Financial Secretary, when delivering his budget on the 23rd of February, announced the legislative proposal on rental enforcement moratorium. Within a specified period of time, landlords will be prohibited from taking action against their business tenants of specified sectors for failing to settle rent on schedule for a specified short period, and the action includes terminating the policy, suspending services, etc. In short, there are four major elements of the bill. On the one hand, the landlord's right to take action against non-compliant tenants would be delayed within the 3-month specified protection period. If the tenant of a specified premises fails to pay rent in compliance with the tenancy, the landlord must not take action in respect of his failure to pay rent. Schedule 2 of the bill provides for the specified premises subject to rental enforcement moratorium. Another part of the bill relates to the right of lenders in taking action against borrowers of secured loans for failing to make repayment. And if the landlord has a repayment default in relation to the premises or the mortgage created on a specified premises during the protection period, the lender will be barred from taking legal action. So this is another kind of moratorium. The bill also provides for an avenue to carve out of the application. In other words, parties like the landlords and lenders may renegotiate with the tenants or borrowers to carve out of the application. Finally, should the bill be passed, it will commence on the date of Gazettal. When the bill was introduced in the Council on the 23rd of March, a Bills Committee was set up, and I'm a member of the Bills Committee. The BPA members and myself repeatedly discussed with the Financial Secretary and other officials relating to the bill. The Business and Professional Alliance represents a business sector. We are well aware of the plight facing SMEs being affected by the fifth wave. At the same time, we should respect free market principle and the spirit of the contract. And for those who are unable to pay rent because of the epidemic, the government is providing breathing space so that these business tenants will not be forced out of business because of legal action taken by the landlords. The BPA supports the government's measure. And at the same time, jobs can be kept, thereby benefiting employees. The BPA believes that opportunities should be provided so that both parties can renegotiate on an agreeable contract or agreeable tenancy agreement so that we can weather the storm together. The BPA is also happy to see that the Financial Secretary has heeded our views and the views of other sectors of the economy and removed the option of 3+3. In other words, the arrangement for the protection period to be extended for another 3 months at its lapse to provide greater certainty. The Financial Secretary also allows for the new tenancy agreement entered into by the landlord and the tenant to be carved out of the application of the bill. The Financial Secretary will be moving an amendment on Schedule 2, basically to extend the coverage of specified premises in relation to food and catering businesses, having taken on board suggestions and comments from the sector. I acknowledge his effort. I so submit. I support the temporary protection measures for business tenants COVID-19 pandemic bill and the Financial Secretary's amendment.
Mr. Shu Ka-fai. Thank you, President. Well, today we're discussing the 3 months rental enforcement moratorium. Mr. Tommy Zhang was the earliest proponent, and last year during the second wave, he hoped that the government can launch a 2+2 proposal. Government covering 2 months of rents, while the landlord will waive 2 months of rents. Altogether, 4 months will help the tenants, and also a moratorium of rental payment of 3 months. Mr. Tommy Cheng will make reference of UK, Australia, and Singapore, helping to help the businesses to weather out this storm, prevent them from closure, and save jobs. After a year of deliberations, the government accepted his proposal and come up with this 3 months protected period, but not the 2+2 proposal. As you can see, a lot of the members have cited this. Well, by delaying payments for a few months, at the end, they still have to pay back in full. Well, dear FS, let's say for this 3 months protection period, a lot of businesses told me, well, I need to pay rent at the end of the day. Why not get government help pay the rent for me? Well, some may help the government to pay the rent for them. Let's say it's a better idea that for the government pay rents for 3 months, or whether you can delay the payment rental for 4 months. Well, I told the industry back then it was unlikely. Well, at the end, the money will flow to developers or the landlords. Well, should we hand over government resources to these instead of directing to the public? Therefore, the government finally came up with the 3 months moratoriums. This 2+2 is out of the table. Now they only offer a 3 months delay or not at all. If you ask the business now, most of which will tell you that we prefer the 3 months delay, otherwise they will close. A lot of businesses have been calling me and asking me whether the bill has been passed or not. Because they're deciding whether to close or not, they might not survive long. Well, I told them that we've been discussing this bill on 27th of April. If we pass the bill, that we'll see the light of the tunnel. A lot of businesses are standing on the cliff edge to close or not to close. If we can't pass the bill, they will decide to fold for good. If we tell them they can give 3 months of breathing space, and for the e-consumption voucher and also the economy is recovering, they must hang on for a little while. Therefore, a lot of businesses are watching, especially those affected by the pandemic. For example, the wholesale and retail, as well as the catering industry of Tommy Chang, they're all watching us. I know there's a huge controversy. Well, from the Liberal caucus members, it seems that we're not taking a uniform line. Well, my caucus members will tell stories of the small landlords, and some may worry whether they will create a precedent, whether their private ownership will be affected. I agree this is all warranted. As of this moment, well, just about who is being more miserable. Well, are the landlords more miserable or the tenants being more miserable? On the fifth wave since the 7th of January to 21st of April, they've been closed throughout. Like President Xi said, we hope to achieve common prosperity. Now they're in the middle of the pandemic. Shouldn't we share the pain together? I believe that's something we must consider. Well, I'd like to thank the developers and the larger landlords. And since the start of the first to the third wave, Tommy Chang and I had visited a lot of the developers and the landlords who are begging them to reduce their rent. Well, developers were quite nice to us. We told them of the plight for the past 3 waves. There were a lot of rental concessions, some of them up to half. As of this moment, 30 or 60% rent reduction. That's showing them they're on the same boat. And some, for those of the scheduled premises, and they need to pay rent till 21st of April, or they're only required to pay the turnover rent. This has been in place for a lot of developers, and some of the smaller landlords willing to offer substantive rental concessions. Therefore, I would like to say thanks to those who are willing to cut rent substantially. However, if all are willing, we wouldn't have this bill. Well, some landowners runs a different calculus. Well, to be fair, some of the landlords are doing quite miserable. Let's say that actually the price of the shopfront dropped substantially. After the FS amendments, for example, on the security enforcement moratorium for fail to meet mortgage payments or pay the interest, well, that will offer some kind of relief. So that, if we scratch each other back, then the pandemic will soon be over and we'll get back to normal. I heard a lot of people talk about sanctity of contracts in the free market economy. Those are the 2 major pillars espoused by the Liberal Party. Well, for a free market economy, let's say I operate a shop that I could right to run my business I want under the law. That's a free market that we should be free from interference. As we all know from the pandemic, it's about the collective interests. Thus, there has been a lot of restrictions. Well, the tourists couldn't come to Hong Kong, and also due to the closure of some premises. If I don't open, how do you call it a free market? Well, we support the government's initiatives, however, we're acting out of public interest. Well, the government is acting out of public interest. which have affected business tenants. Well, there's no more free markets as their shops are closed and yet they still need to pay rent. And some talk about the sanctity of contracts. I understand in Hong Kong that we must respect the contract. Let's say it operates fishball noodle shops. Let the second day into opening, then the sewage pipe broke and he refused to fix it for 3 months in a row. Well, do you think anybody willing to patronize me? Of course, I wouldn't get any customers. While the landlord refusing to fix, then I wouldn't have any money to pay their rent. If I go to the court, will I lose? Yes. Well, it's called force majeure. This is a legal concept. As an exemption clause for natural or social phenomenon which could not be overcome. Natural phenomena includes, but not limited to, natural disasters, let's say earthquakes, typhoons, and flooding and tsunamis. For social phenomena, including, but not limited to war, municipal construction, or other government policies. Well, this time is the government policy. Well, it ordered the closure of businesses. Then I would talk to the landlord. I couldn't open the doors. I couldn't get any income. How can I meet rent? In this case, if the tenant go to the court and cite this force majeure clause, do you think that they will lose the case? Well, therefore, let's say if this bill is passed, you are reducing the lots of lawsuits which the tenants may actually win. At the end of the day, we hope that we can protect their businesses. Then we can protect more jobs. Then let the pandemic go away. For the landlords, well, they do have a commitment or skin in the game. In this 3 months period, you could try to discuss with the landlord for a rental reduction. It's just one way of delaying paying the rent. If at the end you find that the business become unsustainable, I advise that you should just close as soon as possible. Well, you can just vacate the shop so the landlord can lease it to others. If you know that you cannot carry on, I wonder if we can take this step. Therefore, we want to pass this bill when it gives you the opportunity. If you know that your business cannot go forward, you should just save yourself all this trouble. Finally, I would say thank you to the Financial Secretary. This is very controversial. I know that you copped a lot of flack on this. I hope that the new term government, if you're able to stay on to serve the Hong Kong public, please stay on. Thank you. Next, Mr. Andrew Lam.
喺疫情期間，香
Well, during the fifth epidemic, Hong Kong has been bracing for unprecedented challenges. We're all forced to leave the comfort zone. The governance will need to break the existing mindset. Besides supporting the business and the citizens to survive this storm, for example, we need to all take the next extra step. Therefore, I perfectly understand the intent of launching this bill. However, for these extreme measures, the government must uphold certain principles. Private ownership is the bedrock of our prosperity, which the government must defend. To save the weak but require someone to take on more responsibilities can only be short-term. We must provide sufficient protection for the affected groups. In its implementation, we need to offer timely results and need to cater for different scenarios, and we should not do bad things with good intentions. I know that this bill will affect the interests of lots of landlords. I know quite a few of the landlords have heard the appeal, demonstrated the spirit of mutual help. Even though I'm not able to join the Bills Committee to scrutinize this bill, I know that the colleagues and the administration had a thorough discussion and propose some amendments to come up with the final version which catered to all interests. Since I see that this bill must be passed timely, while Mr. Long's amendment involved postponing the commencement, therefore I cannot support him. To support the SME affected by the pandemic, on riding this storm, and on this basis, reduce the risk and difficulty faced by the landlords, I support this bill's passage. I so submit.
Dr. Tan Yue Heng. Thank you, Madam Deputy. The fifth wave of the COVID-19 pandemic started at the beginning of this year. For business activities, in particular for SMEs, they were dealt a heavy blow. Catering, retail, entertainment sectors all suffered because of the social distancing measures, so their business suffered. The administration put forward this bill is to help businesses hit by the pandemic, especially SMEs, is to help them and maintain the business environment, so that for tenants now in applied, they will be offered some relief. And then landlords and tenants would put together and help tenants ride out the storm. This is to prevent massive business closures leading to massive unemployment. So the intention is good and right. It shows that the government is committed to dealing with the issue. So that's why I speak in support of the passing of the bill on the whole. Now, these are special circumstances under the fifth wave, and this bill was prepared in a bit of a rush. So we have to consider, the government needs to strike a balance between the interests of landlords and tenants as well as the community, and that's led to much controversy. There were debate about the length of the protection period and the impact on sensitive contract and so on. The administration responded to all these questions and concerns. There was repeated discussion at the Bills Committee meetings, and I think the timing is right for the bill to commence, and I hope it will commence soon. If we pass the bill, then in the enforcement of the bill, I would like to make two suggestions. First, the government should address the various concerns expressed about the bill. The government should prepare to explain the bill to the public. And when the bill is passed, the government should consider possible inquiries from landlords and tenants, and there may also be calls for assistance, so there should be a hotline for that. This will then provide more information and assistance to affected landlords and tenants. And also, secondly, the government could make reference to the practices in other countries with similar measures, and then they could foresee possible disputes between landlords and tenants, and then the government could prepare for that. Now, for landlords and tenants in particular, individual landlords and tenants, as they discuss the repayment arrangement and so on, the government could give them assistance as far as possible. This is to prevent legal disputes. And then the government could perhaps put in place some form of conciliation mechanism. I speak in support of the bill. Thank you. Dr. Johnny Ng. Madam Deputy, the Financial Secretary has proposed this rental enforcement moratorium. This is to encourage landlords to cut rent and put together with tenants. Now, that's a good thing. But for both landlords and tenants, they are worried about this moratorium. I wrote to the Financial Secretary in early March, putting forward the views of tenants and landlords and the different sectors. Some small landlords express concern that if tenants continue to default on rent payment even after the protection period, or they even just quit, then landlords won't be able to recover. The rent in arrears, and that will lead to more disputes. And for some landlords, they don't have rental income. At the same time, they still have to pay mortgage. So the government should offer more assistance to such landlords. Of course, we understand that in the midst of the pandemic, landlords and tenants need to pull together. But then when the government put forward any policies or measures, it can't just put the burden on landlords. It's not fair to them. So while the government wants to help tenants, it has to consider the hardship of landlords as well. Now, if tenants are not able to pay rent, then the government could give some assistance to or subsidy to landlords. There are such examples overseas. And when tenants terminate the tenancy agreement early, then the government offers some support to landlords. Now, the bill only prevents landlords from taking action in recovering rent. So after the protection period, landlords will still have the right to recover rent from the tenants, and that it gives pressure to tenants, because after the protection period, tenants have to pay both the rent in arrears as well as the rent that's currently due. So that means there's a heavy burden on tenants. Some may not be able to repay the rent, and they will be forced to close down their business. So perhaps the government could offer a guarantee to tenants, say for half of the rent. So that would take some financial pressure off tenants during the epidemic. And then now this moratorium is a good thing for tenants in hardship, but then we have to also consider the interests of landlords. Otherwise, it would just lead to another social issue. So I speak in support of the bill.
Mr. Paul Chair. Madam Deputy. In these extraordinary times, it is very difficult to judge who should be responsible for what. And very often we're concerned when it comes to court cases that a wrong judgment may set a bad precedent. And we're concerned. Although many members have said that the Financial Secretary is courageous in putting forward this extraordinary measure in these extraordinary times, even if this is very controversial, the Financial Secretary has heeded our views and refined the proposal. This effort should be acknowledged, but I'm afraid I cannot support this bill as a matter of principle. And first of all, regrettably, I tried to join the Bills Committee, but under the new mechanism, we had to apply for membership. And unfortunately, I couldn't join the committee. I'd like to air my views here just for the record. Madam Deputy, first of all, when it comes to legislation, it should be proportionate. It should be impartial and fair. Now, I understand that we should put in place measures to help the underprivileged, but now it's not just about a period of 3 months, but more. And I would say that it's a distortion of our well-abided-by principles. Let's say if you want to put in place a mechanism to encourage negotiations between landlords and tenants, or a mechanism allowing a delay of rent payment, then you could just use this word stay of proceedings instead of criminalizing the landlord's legal action. Because we're talking about $50,000 fine or more, or not less than the 2 months' rent. It's really harsh. And for small landlords not familiar with the law, this is really gilding the lily. Why don't you just say No legal action in 3 months. Second point. Again, this is a loophole, and if I put forward my observation, I hope this will not spark another controversy. There is this provision, contract out clause, in clause 4, as long as the landlord receives or sends an email suggesting that I will allow you to pay rent 15 days later than usual, or I'll cut rent by $1,000, then immediately they'll be contracted out of the bill. And this would create uncertainty. So for landlords and tenants, if you want to make sure you're protected, you need to be well aware of the bill. And you should only agree to anything that you find favorable. Because, say, if the landlord proposes cutting half a day's rent, and if you agree, then it's a kind of contracting out. And if any agreement amounts to contracting out of the bill, then it is really very wide. So I'm afraid of the bad consequence despite all good intentions. Madam Deputy, the other point is, if you pursue rent in arrears, you cannot receive rent overnight. Take a look at the long court list. Especially, we just had the general adjournment period, and it may very well take 3 to 5 months before your case is finally heard in court. And even after a award has been granted by the court, you need to apply for bankruptcy or petition, and that means another 6 months. So that's a moratorium long enough, more than 12 months. And it's more than enough of breathing space for anyone. So have you even thought about it? This bill is really unnecessary because this bill affects the rule of law that is very close to our hearts. One point about the rule of law is clarity, certainty. There is no certainty or clarity to speak of in relation to the bill, and this is very serious. Mr. Peter Shiu just now talked about force majeure, and that's true. Force majeure constitutes one ground for another legal battle. So for tenants under pressure, if you want to help them, there is really so much time, so much room for them to negotiate with the landlords. So why such haste in drawing up this bill? Because haste makes waste, and you may be causing bad precedents to be established beyond our salvage. So despite my appreciation for the Financial Secretary's efforts as a legal practitioner, and I must say that we also have members reading law here, but I don't think they are clear about the common law principles, and that we cannot, by enacting legislation, overrule the common law system. The crux of the common law system is that we cannot enact legislation and use statute law to override common law principles. That is the real essence of the rule of law and not rule by law. So for those who read law, please just clear your mind and rethink what you've just said. About retrospectiveness, there is no clear provision barring any retrospective provisions. And according to the government, the protection period begins on the 1st of January. It doesn't mean the provision is a retrospective one. However, it runs contrary to our drafting principle, and that no provision should be drafted in a way to have an uncertain effect on any individual or legal entity that may give a retrospective effect. If you don't respect the rule of law at all, then that's another matter. If you want to respect the rule of law, you should make sure that this principle is respected, and that you should not allow something that happens in the future to have retrospective effect. Now, your explanation is that the period starts on the 1st of January, but again, this is another unnecessary move to hamper the rule of law, and I don't think this is effective at all. So, despite all your efforts, and I reckon that this is a really difficult bill to be drafted. It's no easy task, I know. And for other countries abiding by the rule of law, well, it's true. Australia, UK, Singapore, they have similar legislation. But it's all about proportionality, and that is within proportion. In other words, they need to have the purpose is to have an incentive or a mechanism to allow for renegotiation or subsidy for landlords. And I'm grateful because the Financial Secretary has agreed to impose a similar requirement on banks and mortgagors. But if you want to provide real help, you should give loans to SMEs and needy small landlords instead of having this half-baked idea, because everybody perceives themselves as victims. We just reluctantly support the bill. I know the bill will be passed anyway. My comment is let's just have this bill as a one-off exercise and don't repeat that. Don't be too bold. And you should make sure that it's within proportion, and please do not undermine the rule of law, which is a cornerstone of our success, because international investors are now feeling that Hong Kong does not have a favorable business environment for them. Anything that triggers alarm on the major principles will hamper Hong Kong's competitiveness and undermine our status as an international financial and investment center. Dr. Junice Ho. Madam Deputy, I support the bill. In the current environment, it is important that we weather the storm together. Paul just now referred to rule of law, not rule by law. Well, after all, both phrases carry the same word, law. It's just a matter of which one gives more weight to the word law. So, what is in need of assistance is the SMEs in the schedule. As someone who reads law, we know that there is never perfection. We should only go by things that abide by the principles we agree on. We should then act. Without taking action to help those who need to be helped, when the opportunity passes, then it's just empty talk. About SMEs, Mr. Long proposes an amendment to properly define what SMEs mean. But basically, from the schedule, we learned that we're talking about childcare centers, kindergartens, catering establishments, large ones such as the Maxims. Well, of course, Maxims as a tenant will not scurry off. And, well, the Maxims actually survived the biggest challenge in 2019. And we're now in 2020. I just think that we should apply equal treatment to everybody. About removing supermarkets from the list. Well, we have two major supermarket chains in Hong Kong. And I don't think they will rely on the rental enforcement moratorium. They make huge profits. Somebody asked why we should allow them this moratorium. It's just for 3 months. I'm not saying that they definitely won't fold up after 3 months, but I'm just saying that there is such a slim chance perhaps 0.001% of their closure after 3 months. It has a lower chance than winning Mark 6. That is why the government also has this proposal to allow loans to be taken out under the 100% personal guarantee loan guarantee scheme. The financial secretary is really smart in providing answers to everybody. This measure is supposed to support landlords. For landlords, at least they own a property. It's kind of a secured property. So as guarantor surety of the landlords, banks will be barred from taking actions against them. But then, say, if they really run out of money, they can apply for for loans from banks up to 3 months' rent, interest-free. So I think this bill is good enough. It may not be perfect, and under such circumstances, the financial secretary is willing to take this bold step. So I definitely will support him to run for another term so that he can continue to be smart and do more good for us. Back to the point about rule of law or rule by law. We should not be too humble anymore. The Heritage Foundation of the United States already removed Hong Kong from their list, but it's all right. We just continue to have our own way. Law-abidingness. Hong Kong people are known for the law-abidingness. Everybody wears face masks. Should we criminalize the act? I don't think anyone wants to breach the law, but we need clarity in the bill. It's just like the mask wearing requirement, $10,000 fine for non-compliance. Then isn't it a criminal offense for repeated offenders? So it's inevitable that if you want to implement a policy, there should be a consequence for non-compliance. That's a common law principle. Back to the point of the rule of law, Hong Kong is good at so many things. What about the UK? What about the US? They always talk about the rule of law, but they are the ones who undermine the rule of law. I'm not going to follow their footsteps. We should be confident in ourselves because we know what we're doing and we know what good deeds we do. As long as we stay united, we'll definitely weather the storm together. Well, I actually was a classmate with, I went to the same class with Paul, but then I don't share the same view as far as this bill is concerned. Now, about whether this bill runs contrary to the rights of private ownership of property as enshrined in the Basic Law, Article 105, the government confirms that the bill complies with the Basic Law as well as the Bill of Rights of Hong Kong. Even if this bill is not perfect, we still have the rule of law in Hong Kong. And if need be, we can find a good lawyer like Paul Chair to sue the government. Everything is according to the law. So this bill doesn't put an end to the rule of law. It's just a start. Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I now call upon the Financial Secretary to reply, then the debate will come to a close. Financial Secretary. Thank you, Madam Deputy. Members, First of all, I'd like to thank the Chairman of the Bills Committee, Mr. Tommy Cheung, and other Bills Committee members for completing the scrutiny of the temporary protection measures for business tenants COVID-19 pandemic bill within just a short period of time. The fifth wave of the epidemic has caused a shocking impact to various sectors in Hong Kong. Taking catering industry as an example, according to the sector, an estimated 500 plus restaurants have closed down between February and March this year. Even with social distancing measures starting to be relaxed since last Thursday and the retail and catering businesses are expected to recover, some businesses might no longer to be able to hold on, so to speak. They may closed down. And according to the Census and Statistics Department, in the first quarter this year, when the epidemic was at its peak, about 77,000 people in the retail and catering sectors were either unemployed or underemployed. The proposed legislation is intended to provide business tenants of specified sectors in trouble with a breathing space so that they would not be forced out of business by legal or other actions taken by their landlords if they fail to pay rent on time. Meanwhile, landlords and tenants can be given an opportunity to work out a mutually agreeable rental arrangement in the interim through negotiation. In fact, we've noticed that since the announcement of the legislative proposal in the budget, quite some landlords have provided rental waiver, concession, or restructuring arrangements as a response to the dire situation facing business tenants so as to tide them over difficulties. I appreciate these landlords, and I hope more capable landlords could fulfill their social responsibility and support SMEs together so that they can reach an agreement on a proposal acceptable by landlords and affordable by tenants. Some members may ask whether it is necessary to see through the passage of the bill now that social distancing measures are progressively relaxed. My answer is in the affirmative. As I pointed out, the fifth wave, starting early this year, has dealt a heavy blow to various sectors in Hong Kong. Streets with vacant shop space tell us that many enterprises in Hong Kong are hit hard. Even for tenants still barely hanging on, it will take some time for their businesses or liquidity to fully recover. Without the protection measures offered in the bill, I believe many tenants will be forced out of business due to liquidity problems and hence unable to pay rent. To allow SME business tenants room to recuperate and provide support to them, we believe it is still necessary to implement the bill. And to alleviate the impact on landlords, the bill should be passed and implemented as soon as possible. Mr. President, Madam Deputy, since we announced the legislative proposal, we have been listening to the views of different sectors and the Bills Committee on the proposal of rental enforcement moratorium. And in light of these views, we have refined the proposal. I'd like to take this opportunity to once again thank members for your invaluable input over the past period of time so that we can better gauge the situation and make suitable refinements to the legislative proposal. Next, I'd like to respond to a number of comments. First, on necessity and impartiality of the legislation. Some members are of the view that the government should first consider the prevalence of business tenants' rent default due to social distancing measures before deciding whether legislation is necessary. Of course, it would be most ideal if the government could put forward this protection measure on the basis of comprehensive data. However, we must also have regard to the necessity for timely support for business tenants heavily impacted by the fifth wave. Just like Dr. Shun Tong just now said, this is a matter of urgency. At present, a landlord is not required to inform the government of the tenant's default, so it will take much time to collect the above information and data. This wave of the epidemic has come raging fast, with the magnitude and severity evident in more and more shops closing down in major commercial districts. It is imminent that we provide protection for business tenants. Therefore, it is fully justified to introduce a rental enforcement moratorium as a temporary protection measure for SME business tenants. Some members believe that there is more protection in the bill for tenants than for landlords, and wholly transferring the losses incurred due to tightened social distancing measures from tenants to landlords is not fair. I must point out that the proposed legislation will not take away the right of landlords to receive or the obligation of tenants to pay rent. Moreover, having considered the views from various sectors, we understand that some landlord borrowers may face short-term financial hardship as a result of the moratorium. So we have proposed a corresponding moratorium forbidding lenders from taking action against these landlords and their guarantors and sureties for repayment default. In addition, the government will provide interest-free loan equivalent to 3 months' rent in advance under the 100% personal loan guarantee scheme, subject to a ceiling of $100,000 for landlords who live off rental income and holds proof of being affected by the rental enforcement moratorium. We do not agree with the suggestion that losses suffered by the affected tenants are wholly transferred to landlords. This argument presumes that without this legislation, landlords will not suffer any risk of rent default. This simply doesn't hold water. At the same time, I want to emphasize that the bill seeks to temporarily and for a limited period suspend the right of landlords to take action against tenants with rent in arrears. When the protection period lapses, or when the circumstance as provided in Section 5(9) has arisen, a landlord's right to take action will resume. Also, landlords usually hold deposits equivalent to 2 to 3 months' rent, and some tenants are usually required to provide personal guarantee for business tenancies. That means landlords are not alone in bearing the risk of repayment default. The second point is whether we should require rates, government rent, management fees, and other outgoings under the tenancy to be paid by the tenant for the protection of the ordinance to become applicable. A member has suggested that rates, government rent, management fees, and other outgoings under a tenancy should be paid by the tenant before the protection of the bill applies. In fact, the bill does not draw any distinction between different elements of the rent payable by a tenant. Hence, the moratorium will be applicable to the amount payable as rent under the relevant tenancy, irrespective of the coverage of the said rent, but will not be applicable to separate payments which do not form part of the rent payable under the tenancy. In practice, a tenancy usually expressly provides for the parties responsible for the payment of management fees, rates, government rent, utility charges, and other outgoings. The party responsible for these fees and charges will continue to fulfill their responsibility according to the tenancy, landlords or tenant otherwise, in no uncertain terms. Also, as a refinement to the proposal, the payment of rates and government rents for affected properties will be deferred upon request by landlords or tenants affected, free of surcharge or interest. The rating and valuation department has started to accept applications. The third point is about protection period. Mr. President, Madam Deputy, another concern relating to the bill is the length of the protection period. Affected tenants and relevant trade associations have expressed their wish for a longer protection period for them to recuperate. Some landlords and business chambers, on the other hand, would like a shorter protection period with certainty to cater for the interests of landlords. We understand the concerns of various stakeholders. Having considered the various views, we have decided to expressly provide in the bill that the protection period will be one of 3 months from the commencement date of the bill. We'll drop the provision with the option of extending the period by 3 months so as to enhance certainty of the legislative proposal. In fact, although the protection period will only last for 3 months, the rental enforcement moratorium in the bill covers the period from the 1st of January 2022 to the end of the protection period, between which the business tenants had been most affected by the social distancing measures. We believe adequate protection has been provided to tenants. Madam Deputy, I'd also like to respond to the points raised by members who have spoken. First, members have referred to the concern that this bill may affect our status as an international financial center and whether the sanctity of private contracts will be undermined. My response is that when drawing up the bill, we have acted with caution. And when we consider this issue, let me share this with you. And that is our thinking behind introducing a rental enforcement moratorium in the budget. And meanwhile, I also like to respond to the point about the comparison between Hong Kong and other places such as Australia, Singapore, and the UK. Members have put forward their points of views, and another member also talked about the protection period and whether it's retrospective in nature. I believe these are important points, and I'd like to take this opportunity once and for all to clarify our position. Our consideration is that after Chinese New Year in February, the epidemic was raging, but it had not reached its peak. Our judgment was that we will soon reach its peak. At the beginning of this year, we only had several hundred confirmed cases. By the time I delivered the budget, there were over 10,000 cases a day. So in yesterday's debate, when members talked about the consumption voucher scheme, it came as a surprise to many that we increased the amount to $10,000. That this is exactly because at the time of formulating the budget, we considered that the epidemic was raging really fast, and that the matter was really serious. And we were certain that the grassroots would be the hardest hit. In fact, not only the grassroots. Basically, those most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, not only the fifth wave, are always the grassrooters. So we understand the plight of the people. We understand that the unemployment rate definitely would be on the rise. And if we were able to increase the amount of the consumption voucher scheme, it would be better, especially when last year there was another round of consumption voucher scheme and we already collected data from the general public. And that is why the vouchers would be dispersed in 2 phases, the first in April and the second in summer. our decision was that the epidemic was really emerging rapidly, and the central authorities already spoke out, meaning that professionals were coming to Hong Kong, and the hardware, resources, facilities, everything we needed were coming to Hong Kong from the mainland. And our judgment was that we should be able to put a stop to the epidemic in 2 or 3 months, and that by the time the second batch of the consumption vouchers would be ready in summer. And from the previous year's experience, when we were able to control the epidemic, we would have the fundamentals for economic revival. But of course, it's not enough just to rely on ourselves. We need to reopen the boundary with the mainland. And that is the philosophy of the 3-month protection period plus a 3-month extension option. Members compared Hong Kong with UK, Australia, Singapore. The UK Act has a wider coverage. For us, we only cover scheduled or specified premises of specified sectors. But in the UK, it has a much wider coverage. It covers the whole supply chain and various premises. That is why they also the Act also comes with other measures such as arbitration. In Australia, the Act covers not only business premises but domestic premises, and the period is much longer. It goes for 9 months or even longer. And even in Singapore, the protection period, again, is longer than that in Hong Kong. Like Mr. Tommy Cheung said, we can allow for 2 months rent reduction and then 2 months subsidy. But our judgment at the time was that we couldn't afford to delay the matter any longer. It's a matter of urgency, and we need to we needed to roll this out as quickly as possible so that we could control the epidemic and speed up economic recovery. And that is why we received comments that you don't want 3+3. The retail and catering businesses, of course, would want a 3+3, but for the small landlords alike, they would find the 3+3 arrangement too long. And we just acted decisively and removed the option of a 3-month extension. And that is why, if we act in unity and have a share of this burden, we should be able to weather the storm. And that is why, for all the supporting measures in other jurisdictions, they may not apply to us. Let's say after 3 months, even after 3 months, should there be any rental dispute between the landlord and the tenant, we should go for arbitration. Now, of course, my answer is no, because arbitration is an expensive business. Professionals and experts are involved. Instead, we can go for mediation. And the other idea, for example, in the 3-month period, how about the landlord pays some and then the government pays some? But where should the line be drawn? Say in Singapore, landlords are willing to receive less rent, up to 2 months. But is that something Hong Kong people would find palatable? That is why we just leave things as it is in the bill so that we have room for them to renegotiate. And after all, we're only talking about 3 months, and we do have other supporting measures. Like other members said, for example, we can provide loans for them to pay rent. And in fact, we have increased the amount under the SME Financing Guarantee Scheme from up to 18 months of employees' wages or 6 million as a cap to 27 months of employees' wages or 9 million as the cap. In other words, it's way longer than 3 months' rent. If the tenant believes that his business is worthy to go on, we will provide them with a loan. And otherwise, like Mr. Peter Shill said, they should reconsider the position, and if they think they cannot survive, they should fold up instead. So we're talking about only a short period of time and targeted approach. And apart from liquidity support, we also have the consumption voucher scheme. We seek to give a boost in April and again in July. And also we have the employment support scheme recently rolled out again. In a way, we are helping enterprises, lifting the burden off their shoulders, because we're helping them pay out wages so that they can hold on. Now, what about the suggestion of subsidizing tenants to pay rent? Like I reiterated in the consultation sessions, I'm not going to do that, because the hardest hit group in this current epidemic is the grassroots sector. So many people are out of job, and so many people are trying to make ends meet and struggling to pay rent. If I am to provide assistance from the public coffers, I'd rather lend a hand to the general public, and that is why we have increased the voucher amount under the consumption voucher scheme. If we are using the public coffers to subsidize tenants to pay rent in order to safeguard the interests of landlords, it won't be something acceptable by all. Some members suggested providing tax breaks. Well, we're talking about 3 months only. Tax breaks may be offered for just a period of 3 months or for the whole year. And in terms of implementations, it's way too complex, and it's not worthwhile to change the tax system like that. Mr. Paul Chair just now made another point. He questioned the legality of the bill. He asked whether it's right to do so. And let me put it this way. In drawing up the bill, we scrutinized our proposal very carefully with the Department of Justice. We're talking about a legislative proposal, and that we should pass the proportionality test. There are several elements to this test. I'm not going to go down to the nitty-gritty, except to say that we can withstand any judicial challenge. If anyone wants to file a judicial review, just go ahead. I'll be ready. In the course of taking forward this bill, inevitably, the interests of some may be undermined. But I believe under the current circumstances in society, when we're facing such an unprecedented challenge, it's time for everybody to stand united and help each other out. Mr. Paul Chair also mentioned the retrospective point. Let me just say that if, with members' support, this bill is passed today, and if it takes effect on the 1st of May, that means the protection period will go from the 1st of May to June and then in July. Whereas the relevant rental enforcement moratorium starts on the 1st of January, because this is the start of the 5th wave. This is also a practical point, because instead of using the reference of the 1st of January, we use the 1st of May. This bill would be futile, because it means that the landlords will still be able to pursue rent in arrears from January to April. In other words, there is no protection to speak of, and the end result is bankruptcy. or companies winding up. And that is why, as far as the moratorium is concerned, it should start on the 1st of January as a matter of necessity and practicality. Now, does any provision have retrospective effect upon passage of the bill? We do try to avoid that. But let me give you another example. The Building Management Ordinance. Over the years, because of the legacy reasons, in the beginning, the mutual deeds of covenants of private property provides substantial protection to landlords, to major landlords. And then through years of development, these covenants have now been restricted to prevent landlords from getting too much protection or gaining too much from it. So as long as it is legitimate and that it is proportionate, it is not an issue. In this regard, we have been very careful in formulating this bill. I've spent quite some time in explaining all these points so as to let members understand our philosophy and our thinking behind this policy and the bill. Like other members, many other members have said, this bill is not perfect. There is never a perfect bill. But we're only talking about a 3-month period. It's such a short period for us to provide breathing space to the affected. I would say that the concerns expressed are not really that substantial after all.
I now put the question to you that the temporary protection measures for business tenants COVID-19 pandemic bill be read the second time. Will those in favor please raise your hands? Those against, please raise your hands. I think the question is agreed by a majority of members present. I declare the motion passed. Temporary protection measures for business tenants COVID-19 pandemic bill.